There are three features where the Russian framework of counterterrorism clearly departs from this framework. Firstly, Russian law defines terrorism as an ideology of violence. Their 2006 law on countering terrorism provides a definition which speaks of terrorism as an ideology of violence intended to influence decision makers. It's much a lower threshold than deadly or serious violence against civilians in order to compel the government to do something. Hostage taking would fall under that, but a general influencing or an ideology does not. Secondly, even though the definition of terrorism itself is already broad, Russia expands it by the notion of extremism, which is treated under the same or analogous powers of terrorism, but with further political use. And a third important feature is that although the Russian Federation is a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a supporter of the UN terrorist listing regime, it does not make real use of that regime. There are only 3 Russian individuals, nationals, Chechens, on the UN terrorist list, and 2 of them are already dead. By and large, Russia prefers unilateral action rather than resorting to the international framework. As to the causes of terrorism, I refer to social scientists who distinguish between structural, facilitating and triggering causes of terrorism. It's important to note that human rights violations figure high amongst the structural causes of terrorism and also as triggers for an individual to move from peaceful means to the unacceptable methods of terrorism. Russia performs very badly on both counts because its own actions, including through support to the Ramzan Kadyrov regime in Chechnya, adds to the structural and triggering causes through structural human rights violations, creating resentment and exclusion, and then also by the individual experience of humiliation and human rights violations, which may trigger people to turn to terrorism. Where there is a bit of a tension between human rights and counterterrorism is the level of facilitating causes, how to address use of internet, how to address financing of terrorism, how to address search and seizures for the purpose of detecting weapons. Here, professional counterterrorism people admit that compliance with human rights is important also here. We must address the issue as permissible limitations to human rights rather than unlimited counterterrorism powers, although the threat of terrorism is real and action is required. When assessing Russia's counterterrorism measures in Chechnya or the broader North Caucasus region, as mentioned, it's important to see that nowadays Russia is using the Ramzan Kadyrov regime, just picking one of the armed resistance fractions from the Chechen rebels and supporting it to rule over the others. It's important to note that the Kadyrov regime is using largely the same methods as the terrorists, including extrajudicial and arbitrary killings, collective punishments to family members, terrorizing, creating fear, the civilian population, and creating a shield of impunity. Also, it's important to note that the Kadyrov regime is not less Islamist than its opponents. Rather, on the contrary, Kadyrov makes use of the authoritarian and misogynist features of his own interpretation of the Sharia in order to back up his rule. Hence, in Chechnya, it's not a question between a traditionalist Islamist regime and a secular authoritarian alternative. They are all the same. According to a report by the Russian Justice Initiative, there have been about 250 cases by the European Court of Human Rights identifying gross human rights violations, disappearances, extrajudicial killings, torture, other forms of treatment, indiscriminate killings of civilians during armed conflict, etc. Amongst the cases, there is a concentration in the years 2003 and 2004 as to the timing of the factual events, but it doesn't mean that the crisis is over. The same methods are in place. Those arbitrary killings and disappearances continue, and we have new reports, including from the Ombudsman of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Lukin, that the pattern continues. As an especially troubling category of cases, I do need to mention the murders of human rights defenders, journalists and lawyers. Even though there may not be a single mastermind behind the pattern of these crimes, nevertheless, even if they are committed for various reasons by separate perpetrators, it is a sign of a culture of lawlessness and impunity that these crimes continue to be committed with at least the political support by Ramzan Kadyrov and his regime. This causes a chilling effect in relation to all measures to criticize the government, and also a highly detrimental effect over the situation in the Russian Federation as a whole, because part of these murders have been committed in Moscow or abroad. In closing, Mr. Chairman, I want to mention that Russia is a part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, together with China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. And as observer members, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has India, Iran, Mongolia, and Pakistan. It's a vast region with roughly 1/3 of the world population. And it has chosen a separate path of counterterrorism cooperation as compared to the United Nations framework. Unfortunately, there are two negative features of this Shanghai Cooperation Organization counterterrorism framework. First, it's not based on a common and precise definition of terrorism, but rather accommodates the unilateral definitions by the member states. Hence, each country's terrorism definition counts. And that's broadened by references to extremism and separatism in the framework of three evils: terrorism, separatism, extremism, where China is allowed to define what's separatism and Russia is allowed to define what's extremism, and all are covered by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, aside with terrorism, which itself is defined as an ideology based on the Russian definition. Secondly, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization establishes unconditional extradition between its member states, meaning departing from the international rule of non-refoulement, protection against deportations that risk torture or inhuman treatment of the person. And thirdly, the Shanghai regime is largely secret or intransparent, so that, for instance, intelligence practices or the terrorist list within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are not publicly known. It is known that the list is already far longer than the United Nations list, which comprises at the moment only one living Russian national, whereas the Shanghai list has 1,100 people. We don't know who they are, but many of them would be from the Russian Federation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and sorry.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Shiner. We appreciate you being here, and you know, clearly, you know, there's a lot for us to be concerned about. You touched on this in your testimony briefly about kind of the definition of terrorism. There doesn't seem to be a comprehensive definition of terrorism in international law, and you know, and I'm not sure there's quite yet a consensus in the international community on the certain core elements of terrorism, and that's a problem. You know, as you talked about, I mean, how do we deal with that?
Well, there is underway in the Sixth Committee of the United Nations General Assembly a project towards a comprehensive counterterrorism convention which would define terrorism. I'm not a big believer that that will ever succeed. So I would rather take, as I do in my written testimony, the common elements from, for instance, Security Council Resolution 1566 and the Terrorism Financing Convention, which is one of the newest international conventions. It's true that they define only particular forms of terrorism, but for instance, the Financing Convention goes a bit further in the sense that it tries to distill the common elements of terrorism, which usually are deadly or otherwise serious violence against civilians, bystanders, whatever word you choose, with the intent to compel the government to doing something, or the intent of terrorizing the civilian population, and then list to specific serious crimes. And this is, of course, the point which is vague, right, that we don't have an agreed definition what types of crimes would then count as terrorism crimes. There is the threshold of seriousness. Murder, yes, but what else is included? That's a bit of an open issue.
I understand that you have not had a chance to conduct a country visit to Russia, but in your experience as Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and Counterterrorism, Do you think that that overly broad definitions of terrorism that are used for politically motivated purposes actually fuel terrorist activity? And you know, if you have any reports that can establish that link, but that's one of the concerns that we have.
Mr. Chairman, I would link it to the notion of conditions conducive to the recruitment of terrorism, in common parlance, root causes of terrorism. Overly broad definitions of terrorism result in oppressive authoritarian regimes using secret detention, arbitrary detention, indefinite detention in the name of countering terrorism, and there is a very high temptation of stigmatizing the opponent, whoever it is, as terrorist. And this may result then in new waves of terrorism, because people see whatever we do, if we are religious, if we are political, if we are trade union activists, if we are indigenous activists, nevertheless the government will call us terrorists, so the damage is already done, so who cares? That's a response I see. And I think the situation in North Caucasus is a demonstration of this, that the population doesn't see a difference in the tactics used by the terrorist organizations, the separatists, or the President Ramzan Kadyrov himself. But they see that one party is stigmatized as terrorism, and that means that we lose the moral stigma of terrorism. Right. It becomes a plain political stigma. Another experience I want to refer to is that I did perform country visits to Tunisia and Egypt, where we saw one part of this pattern, the government using the notion of terrorism to get a convenient excuse for oppressive measures, including administrative detention without any judicial oversight. And this became a galvanizing feature in society, so that it put together groups that had previously nothing to do with each other. Some of them were maybe terrorists, most of them were not. Right. But that became a huge force of mobilization simply by an overly broad approach to what the government wants to call terrorism.
Sad thing is this is not a unique problem. Governments all over the world misuse terrorism to justify all kinds of things that have nothing to do with rooting out terrorism, but I appreciate your answer. Let me ask finally, what, if anything, can the United States do to encourage Russia to comply with the international legal framework for counterterrorism and to create a more effective counterterrorism strategy? I mean, it's one of the things we wrestle with all the time is how do you influence in a positive way and not just lecture? And any constructive thoughts you may have would be very welcome.
Well, Mr. Chairman, you yourself referred in your introduction to the World Trade Organization. Right. And the negotiations there. I think trade is always an important factor, and just to make it clear that trade is not separate. Right. From values, not separate from the issue of human rights. I think that's a very good and relevant point. Secondly, I have big hopes about the current U.S. administration making more use of United Nations as a platform for global international cooperation, including in the field of counterterrorism. The U.S. has been a constructive partner in the counterterrorism implementation task force at the UN level, which brings together the different human rights bodies, the different counterterrorism committees of the Security Council, and then the actual law enforcement entities at the international level. I think it's important to retain and strengthen your active presence there. The Russian Federation is hugely interested, and they are present, although more of an observer than actually committed to this international framework. I think it would be important, for instance, at the level of terrorist listings by the United Nations to challenge a bit the Russian Federation that they should come with their own names, not to resort only to their Shanghai Cooperation terrorist listing, but to make more use of UN fora.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And, there are other members that were intending to be here today. They're probably on the floor debating our budget, which is kind of an important thing, that we need to get done. But I appreciate very much you being here. And some of these other members may have additional questions, which they might submit in writing, and I hope that you'd be willing to entertain them in that form. So I thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I will remain available for any written questions there are.
And we appreciate your service too. Thank you. Thank you very much.